Hi everyone, my name is Michelle. I am the author of the blog Hearthside, and I'm just sort of redoing blog entries in a more accessible way. So this is based on my blog entry about the modern interpretation of the wooing of Gerðr. This is a complicated story, and one that's taking me a long time to get some grasp on, and I feel like I'm still figuring it out to some extent. And this is a year later after writing this. So I looked at this entry, and I think like everything that I said, like it's really good. A few things that I think about Gerðr specifically might have shifted a little bit over the course of the year, which is not uncommon for me, especially with ones that are on deities. Like just the more times you look at the stories, look at the lore, the more things you see in them. And I've even said this in some of my previous blogs. The one about Tyr and Fenrir, I've definitely said that story lends itself to being reinterpreted in a lot of different ways. So the story of Gerðr is very similar in that regard. And especially, like, I know from a modern perspective that this is a story that is very problematic, especially in feminist circles, which of course that's me, so here we are. But I don't think that the problems that we're putting on it from a modern perspective are necessarily valuable to the interpretation, because we're viewing it from a perspective that the people of the time wouldn't have. That doesn't mean you should do the things in the story. And in fact, I don't really think that historic heathens would have been trying to emulate the behavior of Freyr and Skirnir either. It's more likely that this, to me, looks like it's potentially a cautionary tale about like how not to act as nobility. And like, I know that these are stories that are about the gods, but my personal perspective is like, I'm a hard polytheist, and I believe in the gods, but the stories were passed down by humanity for many, many years and reinterpreted many, many times to fit the narrative that whoever was the skald or the person who wrote it down wanted to portray. So there's tons of different meanings in them that really don't have anything to do with the gods at all, but they're trying to teach either the listener or the reader something about their own lives, as well as giving a story about the nature of the gods. So the way that I see the lore is that it gives us a window to view the nature of the gods, like different things that they would have like within their encompassing nature, basically. But it's just a window. It's only giving us a glance. And the rest of the story is not about the gods so much, but about teaching people historically, because that's how you would pass on knowledge, is through story. And the stories of the gods are full of action, full of emotion, and they draw people in so that they can then deliver some sort of a message. So I think, like this story in particular is probably one that is trying to teach you something about marriage at that time, specifically within the upper class. But I also did an interesting thing in this blog, and that's that I was comparing this narrative to another narrative that I think is actually quite similar, and this is one that everyone should be familiar with, at least in some form, and that's the story of Beauty and the Beast. So here we have another woman who doesn't seem like, by modern standards, she has like any feminine agency or any choice about who she marries. And there's the same sort of persuasion going on, the threats, the bribes, and there's a magical element to it that comes into play and eventually affects the result. So, like, I'm sure that most people are familiar with the Disney version of Beauty and the Beast. I'm not sure how many of you have read one of the older versions of this story, but the original stories were much darker, of course, than the Disney portrayal of the same story. So in this case, there's these fairies, basically, there's a fairy who doesn't want the beast to be free, basically, because they're in love with him. And then there's another fairy. Oh, there's a squirrel outside. So cute. Anyways, there's another fairy who's trying to make it easier by allowing the beast to communicate with Beauty through her dreams in an attempt to help woo her because she's so put off by his form. So in the same vein, we have Freyr, who has another intermediary, Skirnir, who is wooing on his behalf. So there's definitely like this parallel that I see there. And just like the methods that are used seem very similar. But I think like this is a cautionary tale because women were seen in these roles as peace weavers, and had such ability for building or breaking frith. And it's about what a woman can do to a man's reputation, I guess. If her woman uses her words, then that could start a war, whereas men, usually it was actions that started a war. Women's power was derived from their words, just as a man's power was derived from his deeds. And I'm not saying that women didn't perform deeds or that men didn't say words that were good or cause strife. That happened in both cases, but primarily a woman's words were her weapons. So this is about being careful with your words and making sure you understand the full situation before you make a decision. But it's also about sometimes a marriage isn't for love. And historically, a lot of marriages were about cementing allyship between groups to prevent wars. So the woman's role in that case was to keep the peace and to make sure that the husband was happy so that bad things wouldn't happen. And this isn't really talking about like you or I. Most of us aren't nobility, and like the common folk, it maybe matters less who you marry, but when you're building relationships between tribes and between nations, there's a little bit more responsibility on your shoulders, and sometimes you're doing things for reasons that are much broader than yourself. So I think like there's definitely the same sort of, there's a lot of elements that are similar in these stories, like the absence of the father in both of them, and the complete absence of the mother. Like, we don't even hear anything about Gerðr's mother at all in the story. And we know that Belle's mother is dead. But when these suitors come around, also the father is not there to protect or to offer advice, and it seems like the woman is left with a certain amount of agency. But it's still bound by societal expectation. If you haven't read an original version of Beauty and the Beast, I really suggest, like, if you don't want to read it but you want to hear the story, go on Spotify, go on the podcast Tales. They have like an excellent retelling. That's what kind of inspired this post. Was I was listening to it and then I was thinking about the story of Gerðr as I was listening to it. And yeah, I think it would be really valuable for your understanding of it too, if you wanted to go check that out. Tales is an excellent podcast with different stories from around the world. And they did not pay me to say that. Cool story. So yeah, this is pretty much what it is. And like, I know in modern times we see Beauty and the Beast as more of a feminist story of an empowerment. Belle seems to, in the Disney version, definitely have more agency. The original story was not so much. Now, of course, there are still red flags within the Disney version, just to do with Belle and the situation she finds herself in, and it, like, basically being affected by her captor into making this decision. And yeah, like the whole idea of it being Stockholm Syndrome. So there is still that element in it, even though Belle seems to have a bit more agency in the modern retelling. How would we interpret Freyr and Gerðr's story if we were to retell it in a modern framework? Maybe that would change too, that Gerðr would have more agency like Belle. That's definitely something worth considering. Like, I've thought about it a few times, like whether it's worth finding a way to modernize that story, and really any of the stories about any of the goddesses, because the way they've been recorded and passed on, they've all been written by men, right? So definitely there's that aspect to it as well. But the one thing that I find really interesting is that Skirnir's last way of trying to convince Gerðr that finally works is he's telling her that she will be cursed with lustfulness, and that her lust will be for monsters, which is the Jotun community. But we know that Gerðr is of the Jotun. So it seems a bit strange to me that is what finally gets her, like, that she doesn't, like, why are the Jotun males always portrayed as monstrous, and the Jotun females seem to be partners of the Aesir, whether they become spouses or whether it's more of a fling. But it seems like there's this really big double standard about Jotun men are so bad, but obviously they're of the same tribe. And I mean, you could say they're of the same race, but I interpret it as they're of the same tribe, and that the Jotun is a tribe, and the Aesir is a tribe, and the Vanir is a tribe. And when you're seeing how they interact in these stories, this is talking about intertribal relationships and teaching you about building intertribal relationships. But why would you see the men of your own tribe as horrible? That doesn't make sense to me. So I guess, like, from a modern perspective, you wouldn't want to marry within your tribe because of incest, potentially, if the tribes were all related, I guess. But it just seems like a strange thing to say. But I still see Gerðr as having a fair amount of agency. Even when she agrees to marry Freyr, she sets a time limit, will not meet him for 9 days. And she says, I will not suffer oppression on account of anyone's desires. So she still gets the final word, despite everything. And that's just an example of how powerful women were historically, and the power of their words, and that it had to be respected. It's just, yeah, it's the way that we're viewing it from a place of being outside that time frame that story took place in. And we're just putting things on it, I think, that weren't meant to be perceived within it, based on our own biases. The other things that I wondered about when I was going through this story is who was the real winner in this situation. Like, Freyr gets the woman of his dreams, but has to wait 9 days, and he thinks it's going to kill him. Gerðr still has some amount of agency, but ultimately is still deceived by Skirnir. So the obvious winner to me is actually Skirnir, who gets the sword from Freyr in exchange for his services, which seems like a pretty big deal. And then it makes me question, who is Skirnir? He's not really in the lore too much. We know he's a servant of Freyr. He claims to have magic. So it seems to me like maybe he's a Vanir god, which, I mean, Freyr is, so that would make sense. But he's claims not to be Vanir, Aesir, or Alfar. So what does that leave? Is he a man? Is he a Jotun himself? It's really a strange construct within the story that I can't quite figure out, and it could just be muddying from it being passed down the way it was and then recorded by someone who didn't have all the pieces of the story, or didn't understand them, or was intentionally trying to obscure them. So I guess we might not ever know that, but it's just something that I'm kind of like, what does that part of it mean? But when we're looking at Freyr and Gerðr within the story illuminates different parts of their natures, like I say. There's lots of stories about Freyr, but there's not so many about Gerðr. So we are looking at her, and who is she? I usually start with the etymology. Gerðr means enclosure or stronghold, which makes sense within her story. She's living within her own enclosure, her own home within Jotunheim. But there's also layers to that as well, because she's a woman, she's charged with the care of the home, and that's her domain. It also could have a sexual element to it, about the enclosure being the womb, and about being receptive. And I do see, because Freyr has all of the energies coming from agriculture and that sort of thing, that would make sense that this is a story about fertility. And if we see Gerðr as being like the womb of the ground, and Freyr as falling in love with her, then this is the story of the changing of the seasons. Gerðr's coldness towards Freyr can be seen as the winter. And then her thawing is when Var comes, when the thaw comes before the summer. And that's possibly the story. There is connections with the idea of corn, although we have to understand that corn in a historical sense can mean grain in general. So again, we're seeing that agricultural element of the fertility of the land. And similarly to the Hellenic story of Hades and Persephone. And we're seeing that if Gerðr's a goddess of fertility, that she has a soft feminine nature, but also power and agency, and that she holds influence over men in their lives and their communities. She has the ability to turn heads with her voice. And also, we know about Gerðr that she's beautiful and graceful, and this is another power that she uses within her feminine charm in order to spark change. She hopes for a better future. She is the frith weaver, but she's also a strife maker. And that's the way women are, is they have both the capacity to be a frith weaver and a strife maker, because both are necessary roles. We often are like, oh yeah, we build frith, but sometimes building frith with the wrong people actually hurts our luck. So sometimes we need to hold our grounds and set boundaries. Sometimes we have to protect the enclosure. And in this case, the enclosure for Gerðr, it could be herself, her family, her community, or it could be more encompassing as what is sacred. She is full of quiet strength, and she is the power of the feminine to bind the family together, even in hard times. She is a weaver, as all women are. She has the ability to temper the will of men when it requires tempering, but also empower men when they need empowering. And she can weave words, weave frith, and also women are known to weave literal fabrics as well as metaphorical. So this is what binds communities and families together historically, and to some extent in modern heathenry as well. Women ensure the survival of their families and their tribes. They nurture and harvest the crops. They quietly allow seeds to fruit. And when the men are away, they're the ones that are in charge of making sure that the community is successful. It seems like there's this interesting tendency within the lore for the Jotun women to become members of the Aesir through marriage. And then that is what supposedly makes them worshipful. It seems to me like that's a complicated thing about femininity is that their value historically is linked to their unions. Through a modern lens, of course, that's a little bit more difficult to accept. We have different ideas of how society should be run now. But the bottom line is that Gerðr is a goddess and she is worshipful. And her power is her agency. And she isn't this weak woman who basically succumbs to the will of men. She is doing what is within her power to be done to set her boundaries. And the lesson that she teaches modern women is about setting boundaries and about personal power. So we shouldn't just discount her because her story doesn't fit the modern feminist lens. If Gerðr's story was in modern times, it would probably go quite differently. She would still have the same spunk and tenacity, and her underlying nature would remain the same. And then if we look at Freyr as well, and what the story illuminates about him, Gerðr balances him and stays his ego. He's still the one who sows the seed, and he sparks the life in the barren fields and allows the summer to return. He is the sun that warms the earth. And Freyr sees what Skirnir misses. He knows how to wield the sword. So he gives up the sword to balance the power between masculine and feminine, and to give agency back to Gerðr. He relates to the feminine by getting in touch with his own feminine side and allowing himself to be vulnerable. He dares to love even though he's told that is not how to woo a woman. And the sword can only be wielded by a wise bearer. He exercises prudence and he recognizes the need to be soft and sensitive. He allows the sword to fight for itself, just like he allows Gerðr to speak for herself. And Freyr is the Vanir's influence over nature, combined with the Aesir's influence over order. So the result is order in nature. And this is how he comes to be associated with agriculture. He combines the elements of the sun, the water, and the earth to create life, and he understands the necessity of a steady hand. He is impatient with his desires of creating order, but also sees the necessity of waiting for the correct time, of trusting the power of union to bring seed to fruit. And nature fruits in her own time. Order can be created in nature, but it is still subject to nature's rules. The role of Freyr in the story is that he needs to create balance so that order can be achieved in nature. He suffers in the winter so that in the summer it can come again, and so that the crops can grow and be bountiful. He waits even when the waiting is unbearable, and he does not seek to control what he cannot control, even though it makes him seem weak. So that is actually his strength. So that's what I'm seeing in the story through this lens, through interpreting it the way that I did. There's so much more that can be said about Gerðr, but I have been going on for a while, so I will leave you to it, and I'm sure that I'll write more about her in the future. Thanks for listening. See you next time.